In today's video, I want to discuss some additional NHL trade rumors of things we might see happen during the offseason. This includes teams like the Blackhawks, the Flyers, the Columbus Blue Jackets, as well as the Florida Panthers. Plus, we have some interesting updates from the general managers meetings I want to discuss as well. We'll get into all that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as mentioned, we have a variety of things I want to discuss today, and let's kick things off with some of the updates we've had from the GM meetings taking place down in Boca Raton, Florida, where some very interesting items are being discussed. Of course, we had the first update, which came a couple days ago, indicating that they reviewed the emergency backup goaltending policy and made the decision that there would be no changes. They feel the policy is working just fine, and I know there was a lot of difference of opinions out there with the David Ayers situation, where he came in to play goal for the Hurricanes against the Maple Leafs, but ultimately that's what the policy is there for. And they decided that no changes need to be made. Of course, there's also been some talk about a salary cap for next year, and we have a projection, which they usually give at these meetings, which ranges from $84 to $88 million. Now, of course, that either one of those numbers or range in between would be a nice jump from the current salary cap of $81.5 million. So either way, they should be seeing some decent increases, but as we saw last year at these meetings, the numbers that the NHL provided to the GMs at these meetings actually ended up coming in number once the final number was decided upon, and many teams were left scrambling and ran into the cap issue. And we saw many teams have to go into LTIR relief this year just to stay afloat. So clearly, that number is not something you can bank upon. It's still early yet. There's still some more revenues that need to be calculated and finalized before they can come to a hard number. Plus, there's also the NHLPA that has an escalator clause where they can increase it so much percentage per year as well. Now, that's a clause, personally, I have issues with. I mean, you're kind of pitting part of the PA against each other. You have guys that are free agents that certainly want it escalated as much as possible, which means there's more room for teams to spend money on them. And then you have other guys that are already under contract that are concerned about escrow and how much they're going to have to pay in based on all these numbers as well. And it's just, it kind of divides them, in my opinion. I'm really not a fan of it. I think they either need to have a set amount that the PA can do every year so it's consistent at least, or just get rid of it altogether. But either way, that number has to be finalized by the PA. And of course, we don't know what that's going to be. We won't know until a later time. But either way, it's a pretty significant increase in the salary cap, which will certainly give a lot of teams some relief that they need moving forward. Some teams will spend right to the cap, of course, some will not. Just depends on the situation. Now, of course, the other big item that came out of this as well in the last day or so was the Arizona Coyotes situation. Of course, they are under some allegations, some pretty serious ones, and could be facing some pretty serious repercussions as well, where they've been accused of doing a lot of testing with junior age hockey players that violate the NHL rules. Now, there's an NHL draft combine every year leading into the NHL draft, where there's a lot of players invited to that. So that's when all teams have equal access to these players to do this to any kind of testing that is being conducted. If there's players that are not invited to that or anything else, then they can do stuff afterwards. But there's several cases being pinned against the Coyotes of cases of violating that beforehand, and the other 30 GMs certainly appear to be relatively upset about this, much more than the Coyotes. Don't really feel like they've done much of anything wrong, or at least don't seem to be thinking it's too serious of an allegation. But TSN insider Darren Dreger has reported that they could be facing some pretty serious allegations. Ultimately, once the investigation is conducted and concluded here, it'll be up to Commissioner Gary Bettman what he feels is sufficient. Now, it could be a substantial financial impact where he could impose a large fine against the team. Of course, they just came under new ownership. They've had their financial struggles, so that could be a major issue, especially for the new owner who wouldn't have been involved with the team at the time. So that would be, a pretty significant issue for them, I would think. There's also the possibility that they said that even like a high-ranking executive, maybe like a John Chayka, could be forced to be let go. Ultimately, he's responsible for hockey operations, and whether or not he was directly involved or more scouting or whatever, either way, it's his department, so he's ultimately responsible. So it could be something like that, or they could be forced to end up losing draft picks. That's another issue. They could strip them of some picks, and obviously that would impact their potential future here, depending on which ones they take, especially if they take first rounders or something. That could be a big problem. So clearly the Coyotes are still under our investigation here. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but it's been discussed further at these meetings, and ultimately we won't know until the investigation is concluded and Gary Bettman makes his final decision on what that's going to be. Now, as I mentioned as well, I want to discuss a few trade rumors that are kind of on the horizon here in the rumor mill, things that we might see happen during the offseason. There's clearly some teams not happy with how their season has gone, and there's already lots of rumblings, the things that might happen during the summertime. Now, of course, one of the teams I wanted to talk about today that could be facing some pretty substantial change would be the Florida Panthers. Now, the Panthers went out last summer, and they spent a ton of money. Owner Vinny Viola really committed a lot of cash to goaltender Sergei Bobrovsky, who's underperformed greatly given the contract that he was given. Of course, they also went out and signed guys like Anton Stralman and Brett Connolly. They brought in a big-time coach who commanded a big salary in Joel Quenneville. So they really went all in. They really spent a lot of money to really improve this team. The attendance numbers are still not where they need to be. They're still under 14,000 on average per game, which compared to last year I think might be a bit of an increase, but either way, it's still not where it wants to be. I mean, the Panthers are kind of dwindling right now for their playoff hopes. For a big chunk of the year, they were in the mix, but as time's gone on here, they've kind of slowly fallen out of the mix, and it might be at a point where it's going to be very difficult to get back into this point. It's not completely out of the question, but as each game goes by without making more ground, it's going to be tough because it's looking like there's more likely going to be 5 teams from the Metro, 3 teams from the Atlantic, so they'd have to catch the Leafs, and there is a bit of a gap there now after some stumbling blocks reached by the Panthers, and obviously they kind of got behind the 8 ball. So with all that being said, obviously you can't spend all that money and not expect changes when the results don't come. So clearly it's being rumored here that they could attack the core of this team and really shake things up further. Of course, they signed Bobrovsky to a 7-year contract. He's in year 1. So obviously we're not looking at really a trade or buyout or anything like that. They really can't do much of anything with Bob in the net. He just has to play better, and they need to hope that he can bounce back and do stronger play moving forward. Of course, Joe Quenneville, don't know the exact terms of his contract, but more likely it was a 5-year deal. That seems to be the trend and common term for the top coaches around the NHL, the most pedigree and experience. So he's in for the long haul too. So that leads us down to some of their core players, which would include guys like Huberdeau and Barkov, maybe Ekblad. They also have some pending UFAs like Hoffman and Dodonov, who certainly put up some pretty good offensive numbers, but it's debatable right now whether or not they return. But obviously one of the big 3 there that I mentioned are under contract for an extended time, like Ekblad, Barkov, and Huberdeau, could see themselves moved out of town. Now, out of the 3, only Jonathan Huberdeau has a no movement clause in his contract because he was the last of the 3 to negotiate a new deal, and he's just eligible. This is the first year that he has it in the contract. It just kicked in at the beginning of the season, so that might be more tricky to do. So you might have to look to a guy like an Ekblad or a Barkov. Now, it's hard to imagine the Florida Panthers trading their captain, Alexander Barkov, who has become one of the game's top two-way players, largely considered an underrated player, a guy who might not get as much of attention because of where he plays compared to some of the other bigger markets, but ultimately it might take a big deal like that to really shake things up to improve this hockey club. Even though trading Barkov might seem like a crazy idea, they would get one heck of a return, and the summertime would be the time to do it when teams have more flexibility. Of course, Aaron Ekblad's another potential trade target, but really, if you look around the team, their defense is not great. The fact that they have him, who they drafted first overall, and even though he might not be regarded as highly as some NHL defensemen, he's still a pretty solid part of their back end there, and I just can't imagine them weakening the defense even further. It makes more sense to trade a top forward where they have a lot of offensive players. They're one of the more offensive teams around the NHL, and if they did make a trade to kind of change their salary cap situation, obviously that would potentially free up more space to bring back a guy like Dodonov or Hoffman or what have you. It's hard to say what direction they're going to go in. Ownership was not happy with the results, and as it was reported ahead of the NHL trade deadline, that they were instructed to cut payroll, which is a big part of the Vincent Trocheck trade. That was a combination of payroll as well as kind of shaking up the core a little bit because Trocheck had been there a long time, was a big part of their team, and clearly, like I said, that kind of accomplished multiple things at the same time. So I guess we'll have to see what else the Florida Panthers do. I think Barkov would bring back the biggest haul, but do you really want to trade a player like that? It's a really hard trade to win when you're trading a player of that caliber. Like I said, he's a sulky caliber kind of a two-way forward who really does a lot of things well, very offensive, very defensive, and super strong guys, their team captain. But, when the results aren't there, something's got to be done, and there's just too many other guys that were recently brought in that they're kind of tied to and really don't have the option to move anytime soon. So let me know what your thoughts are. If the Florida Panthers are to make some big moves like being rumored, what makes the most sense in your opinion? Now, in a recent interview as well, Toronto Maple Leafs forward Jason Spezza has confirmed that he has no intentions to retire. He wants to keep playing into next season, and he also confirmed that he has not had any contract extension talks to sign with the Leafs for another year. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's really not something that's on the front burner for the Leafs. They're really focused on getting into the playoffs, and clearly, Spezza's had a pretty nice season. He certainly had his struggles early on, didn't really fit with the way Mike Babcock wanted to use him and how he was running the team, but since Sheldon Keefe took over, Spezza's fit in much better and has played a pretty solid role, pretty cheap contract for the bottom six, and personally, I would not be surprised at all if the Maple Leafs opted to bring him back on another cheaper one-year contract. He very well might want a little bit more money than he did this year, though. Clearly, he was coming off a disappointing end to his time with the Dallas Stars, but has certainly rejuvenated his career and had a pretty good year for Toronto. I can't see him demanding too much money, but either way, Spezza returning to Toronto for another season certainly makes a lot of sense, and I would be quite surprised if they don't make every effort to make that happen. But either way, regardless of what the Leafs want to do, Spezza's made it clear he intends to want to keep playing beyond the current season. Now, taking a look now at the Columbus Blue Jackets, there's a lot of reports indicating that there might not be a very good relationship between Josh Anderson and the Blue Jackets, and he very well could be traded ahead of the NHL draft or free agency this year. He is a pending restricted free agent. Unfortunately, he ended the season on an injury note. Has been out for some time with a shoulder injury, ended up having surgery, and is out for the season at this point. So no more Josh Anderson for the 1920 NHL season. There was some trade rumors surrounding his name leading into the NHL trade deadline, and there were some teams making inquiries, and it was believed that one team was really serious making inquiries, but they weren't able to get the deal done, which I would fair to assume that it's probably due to the injury concerns. And obviously, at that point, the Blue Jackets could not, in good faith, trade him knowing that he was likely heading down the road of having season-ending surgery. So it did not happen, but there certainly would be further interest in the summertime. He's a unique kind of player, can play a power forward type of game, physical player, has some offensive talent as well, and there certainly would be interest, but it's not clear exactly what he's going to want for a contract, or if it's more about just a relationship and the whole scenario with him in Columbus. Hard to say, but reports out there are indicating that they feel that he very well is a prime trade target for the offseason. Now, there's also a lot of rumblings that the Philadelphia Flyers could finally pull the trigger on a Shane Gostisbehere trade this offseason. Clearly, the Flyers are one of the hottest teams in the NHL right now, well on their way to making the playoffs, but as the Metro Division is so tight, it's not a given here as of yet. Their spot is not locked in, and even if they do make it, are they going to be first, second, third, a wild card? It's really not clear, but the way they've been playing, the way they've been winning right now, they're certainly well on their way to securing a higher spot. That much we can say for certain, but Shane Gostisbehere's had a second consecutive disappointing year, and even though he had a 65-point season a couple of years ago, came into the NHL looking with a ton of talent, with a ton of offensive upside, the results have not been there, and it looks as though he might be really at a point with the Flyers that he really is not part of their future, in my opinion. He's got a decent contract, and if he can get back to that point of being even a 40, 50-point guy, then that contract is more than reasonable and could generate a lot of interest from around the NHL. There's going to be some teams looking for help on the left shot defense. I know Montreal is one that certainly comes to mind. Amongst others, there was some link before with Montreal and Gostisbehere, which is why I brought them up. But clearly, I just don't see him fitting into their long-term plans the way things have gone the past two seasons. I know Chuck Fletcher was reluctant to move him before, but based on everything that's gone on, he's another player to watch this offseason. I would think he'd be a prime target to be traded at the NHL draft. There's lots of teams out there, especially ones who may not necessarily be playoff teams right now, that have some higher picks out there that might be willing to move a higher pick to acquire a player like him with term, with a ton of potential, with the hope that they can get him back playing the way he did a few years ago. Of course, the Philadelphia Flyers are a team right now who's got a really good mix of veterans and younger players, and they have a fair bit of picks and prospects in their organization as well. So it's not quite clear what the asking price would be, but regardless of what the price is going to be, he's a prime target for trade this summer. The Chicago Blackhawks situation in goal appears to be a little bit messy. Ahead of the deadline, it was reported that Robin Lehner was only offered a 2-year contract. There were some negotiations going on to keep him as a goalie in Chicago for an extended time, but they weren't coming anywhere close to what he wanted for a contract, which is ultimately why they decided to trade him, and now he's a member of the Vegas Golden Knights. Now, Robin Lehner, of course, didn't have the greatest start to his career. He was kind of inconsistent during his time in Ottawa, but always had a lot of potential. potential. He'd gone on to play in Buffalo, and then after all that, we come to find out that Robin Leonard, during his time in Ottawa and Buffalo, struggled a lot with some personal issues, including addiction. And once he was able to get over that and be clean, that he still got a fresh start with the Islanders, had an amazing season. Unfortunately, didn't get re-signed there, had another really solid year in Chicago, and then he's looking for a longer-term deal with fair compensation at this point. He's not willing to take any more deals. He feels he's earned the right to a longer-term deal at fair market value, and I must say I totally agree with him. And really, I'm surprised that the Blackhawks, given their situation and where their team is at and where their goalie situation is at, that they wouldn't make that kind of commitment to him. But ultimately, that's why he ended up leaving. So clearly, Malcolm Subban right now, I'm not really sure he fits into their long-term plans as well. And some believe that Subban will either be let go or traded during the offseason. And they very well will bring back a longtime goalie Corey Crawford, but only if he's willing to accept a short-term contract. He's in his mid-30s now. He's had a lot of concussions, a lot of health issues, and clearly, as much as they'd like to have him part of the organization, they can't put all their eggs in his basket. They're going to need another, 1A, 1B, or another backup goalie who can really lighten the load for Crawford, because Crawford's made it clear as well in previous interviews, he feels he can still be a starting goaltender and really wants that kind of role in order to be signed to a new contract. So will they remain with Crawford and hit the goalie free agent market for another potential backup? I mean, there's going to be some interesting names out there, some starters, some backups, some can be like a 1A situation. Not really clear who they would target, but it looks as though the goalie situation in next year in Chicago is likely going to be Crawford and possibly somebody they sign as a free agent. And lastly here, I want to touch on the Buffalo Sabres. Now, the Sabres are a team that seems like they've been rebuilding forever. Of course, this year, again, like last year, they had a really solid part of the early season where they had a massive winning streak. We're sitting good in the standings. Things were looking to be on the up and up here, and they were moving forward. But then, of course, they came back down to earth. They crashed down, and now they're well out of the playoffs and on their way to missing yet again. And unfortunately, young superstar Jack Eichel still will not get a taste of NHL playoff hockey. There are some rumblings wondering if GM Jason Botterill, who's been at the job for a few years now, very well could be on the hot seat, and maybe once the season ends, could we possibly see a GM change? I mean, he's gone through a couple of coaches, so he's already played that card. He's made some trades. He's had a hard time finding the talent they need. The Sabres clearly have holes in multiple areas. Not really clear exactly for goaltending for the future. I mean, Ullmark, could be the guy, but I'm not really convinced 100% that he is right now. They do have some bright spots on defense, like Rasmus Dahlin, for example. Joker Hyru's been a good spot. Brendan Montour I like there. There could be some more talk about Rasmus Ristolainen maybe being a trade target. I know he had requested a trade before, and now seems to be more content to stay, but could be a trade chip that they re-explore. At the forward position, Jeff Skinner's had some major setbacks as well, so clearly not really clear. This team needs a lot of pieces, and they may not have the confidence that Jason Botterill can be the guy to get that done. So I guess we will remain to be seen here, but there's a lot of rumblings. GM Jason Botterill might be on the hot seat, and the Sabres might be one of the first teams to make a change in GM this offseason. So that is all your updates for today. Of course, as always, want to know your thoughts and opinions and everything down below, so make sure you leave some comments and we can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it as well. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.